Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
With no fees or minimums on checking and savings accounts and an app that lets you bank anytime, anywhere, choosing Capital One is like the easiest decision in the history of decisions. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. Capital One, N.A., member FDIC.
Hello, it's 5 p.m. on Wednesday in Portland, Oregon, 9 a.m. Thursday in Hong Kong. This is the BBC's Business Matters. Today, tough questions for Vladimir Putin in Geneva.
The list of your political opponents who are dead, prisoned, or jailed is long. What are you so afraid of?
We'll assess his answers, and we'll ask whether economic problems drove him back to dialogue with America.
All of these Russian activities that have been going on over the past 6 years have isolated Russia, have, tanked Russia's economy, have isolated Russia from American and Western investment. And basically, he's offering Mr. Putin a fig leaf.
Also today, no change in US interest rates despite rising inflation. Does the Fed have a plan B? And later, the blizzard of prizes on offer in lots of different countries for those willing to get over their vaccine hesitancy. Let's start with the news.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. President Biden has warned his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, that if the imprisoned opposition activist Alexei Navalny were to die, it would be devastating for Russia. Mr. Biden was speaking after his first summit with President Putin in Geneva, at which he also raised concerns about 2 American citizens in jail in Russia.
How could I be the President of the United States of America and not speak out against the violation of human rights? I told him that's why we're going to raise our concerns about cases like Alexei Navalny. I made it clear to President Putin that we'll continue to raise issues of fundamental human rights, because that's what we are.
The 2 presidents described their meeting as positive and constructive, but made clear that significant differences remained between them. The US Attorney General has reversed a controversial Trump administration policy on immigration, which made it more difficult for those fleeing domestic or gang violence to be granted asylum. Merrick Garland's ruling restores asylum laws to how they were before Mr. Trump took office. David Willis reports.
President Biden has been highly critical of his predecessor's immigration policies and has set about creating a system which he says is more humane. This move by the Attorney General Merrick Garland will make it easier for those fleeing domestic or gang violence at home to win asylum claims in court. But it comes at a time when the Biden administration is already struggling to control a surge of migrants at the country's southern border, and as the number of children crossing into the US is approaching an all-time high.
Save the Children says more than 700,000 Rohingya children are facing severe discrimination and denial of their most basic rights across several different countries. The aid agency says the children are vulnerable to sexual abuse, trafficking and detention, as well as being forced to work. Hundreds of indigenous people in Brazil have clashed with police during protests against a government bill that could open up access to their ancestral lands for farmers, loggers and miners. Leonardo Rocha reports.
Police in the capital, Brasilia, say they responded with pepper spray after some of the protesters wearing body paint and feather headdresses launched arrows in their direction. Members of different ethnic groups have gathered in Brasilia to show their discontent with the bill. The legislation was initially proposed in 2007, but it has been modified and reinstated in Congress by President Jair Bolsonaro and his supporters. Indigenous leaders say the bill is a huge threat to them. It will restrict the official demarcation of their ancestral lands and will effectively legalize mining and farming inside their reservations, which has until now been banned.
World News from the BBC.
Hello, welcome everyone. Fergus Nichol here with the BBC's Business Matters. Let's welcome our guests this hour. From Portland, Oregon today, Mitchell Hartman, senior reporter for Marketplace on American Public Media. Mitchell, it's been a while. Great to have you back on the programme.
Yeah, good to be back. Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Wednesday afternoon on the West Coast. And let's say hello this morning, Thursday morning, to the author and former civil servant Rachel Cartman, back with us from Hong Kong. Morning, Rachel.
Good morning. Good middle of the night to you. Huh?
Yes, good middle of the night. Just after 1 here in Shrewsbury. I'm in the studios of Radio Shropshire. Our colleagues in London doing all the magic to keep us on air. Let's start in Geneva, where the Swiss were hosting the heads of Russia and the United States, and even if relations between those two countries haven't been at their lowest point for decades, Wednesday's face-to-face encounter between Presidents Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden would always have been closely watched. There are so many issues on which the two are at odds, including the jailing of Mr. Putin's political opponent, Alexei Navalny, and Russian interference in the 2016 American presidential election, and Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, and then there's hostile activity in cyberspace. Now, on that issue, when Mr. Biden spoke to the media after his meeting with Mr. Putin, he relayed what he'd said on cybersecurity.
I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities, 16 defined as critical infrastructure under U.S. policy, from the energy sector to our water systems.
And you may remember we followed the Colonial Pipeline hack quite a lot on this programme a couple of weeks back. Anyway, President Putin's response, not us, Governor.
U.S. sources, I don't want to make a mistake here as to the name of this organization, but the U.S. sources claim that the majority of cyber attacks are made from the U.S. territory. Then the second one is Canada, then 2 Latin American states, and then the UK. As for Russia, it is not listed in this ranking of countries that see the significant number of cyber attacks.
There you go, completely innocent parties. Anyway, a lot of negatives to wade through in the pursuit of common ground. Olga Ivshina of the BBC's Russian service was watching to assess Mr. Putin's priorities.
For Putin, I guess the most important topics are situation in Ukraine, Belarus, and most importantly, bilateral relations between US and Russia, because, both sides agree they're at the lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And what's important for Russia, these huge political tensions influence Russian economy, which is already stagnating. And for Putin, it's an important internal political question, because in a way that's a battle between a Phrygian and a TV set for the Russians, because from TV they hear all the time that, Russia is strong, things are improving, less and less people are still in poverty, the level of living is increasing, but what they see are growing prices, a stagnating economy, serious inflation, and for them these two messages don't match.
Well, one reason for the stagnation that Olga referred to a couple of times there has been the sanctions under which Russia has been placed from the US and from the European Union, and many date back to Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine back in 2014. These sanctions mainly target the defence, energy and financial sectors, but the effects are felt more widely. Latest round of American sanctions was introduced just a couple of months back, and more are in the offing. Let's get back to those separate media briefings. Quite interesting. After the face-to-face, Mr. Putin came out first, spoke at some length, and then he was followed subsequently by Mr. Biden. I asked Nina Jankovic of the Wilson Center in Washington to pick out a highlight from each leader's remarks.
Well, I'm not sure I'd call it a highlight for Mr. Putin, more of a low light, really. He really relied on his strategy of whataboutism. For every question he was asked about his bad behavior, about Russian aggression or Russian election interference, he had a counterexample that he alleges the United States was involved in the same thing. When asked about human rights, he countered with treatment of protesters at the Capitol on January 6th during the insurrection, which now, of course, Russian media has been spinning as an assault on human rights. Similarly, he talked about Guantanamo Bay and gun control in the United States. And these, of course, are lines we've seen Russian propaganda repeat over and over the past nearly a decade as U.S.-Russian relations have worsened. On the other hand, President Biden started his news conference with a really strong salvo about human rights, about democracy, and about what he hoped to achieve, not just for the American people who he was representing today, but also for the Russian people and the fact that they deserve a better government that is more responsive to their needs. And I thought that was very strong. He hopes for cooperation, but didn't promise anything in his remarks and said, we'll see in the next 3 to 6 months what our respective countries can come up with in that regard.
I'd like to play you one question that really struck me, and there's a lot of discussion of this question on social media. It was Rachel Scott from ABC News, and she had what was kind of cunningly disguised as a follow-up, but it was quite a humdinger for Mr. Putin.
The list of your political opponents who are dead, prisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption, but Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
And the interesting thing, Nina, was that Mr. Putin kind of shrugged that one off so comprehensively. I was wondering whether it was even translated in his ear.
Well, Mr. Putin has this habit of not referring to Alexei Navalny by name. He calls him this man, or calls him, someone who has broken the law, this criminal. This really, tracks with his strategy of not acknowledging Alexei Navalny's his existence and the popularity of his movement. I'm sure it was translated. I think, again, he's just really adept at dodging these questions and somehow is able to get away with it even after all these years.
Is there an economic imperative for Mr. Putin to talk to Joe Biden and by extension the G7 and NATO and all the people that Mr. Biden's just been talking to? Or to flip the question the other way around, can Mr. Putin afford another Cold War?
Well, certainly President Biden laid out today that in his view, all of these Russian activities that have been going on over the past 6 years have isolated Russia, have, tanked Russia's economy, have isolated Russia from American and Western investment. And basically, he's offering Mr. Putin a fig leaf and saying, if you roll back these activities, we might be able to welcome you back into the club of the world's greatest economies, although I'm not sure I'd put Russia there myself. I think this is the argument that President Biden has made with Mr. Putin today and laid it out very clearly, that he is isolating himself, that although these actions that he is pursuing might get him domestic support, in the long run, no one is going to trust enough in the Kremlin to do politics with the Kremlin, to do business in Russia, and to invest in the Russian economy for the long term. Whether or not Mr. Putin will heed that advice is another story. He seems very happy to put the future of the Russian people in jeopardy just to achieve his own political goals.
I don't usually rely on my colleagues to ask all my questions for me, but I'd like to cite another American broadcaster who noted this time on social media, Nina, and I'll quote briefly, "The media paroxysm over the Biden-Putin meeting is an historical artifact. There's far more at stake with China." Is that right? Is that the invisible third party?
Yeah, I think this was an intentional maneuver on behalf of the Biden administration. Certainly, we know the Biden administration is concerned about China. We know the G7 and NATO are concerned about China after all the readouts over the past week. What the Biden administration doesn't want is a continually closer relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping. There has been a lot of cooperation there over the past several years. And I don't think America wants to see that cooperation continue. So the idea there is to create some common ground with Russia so that, we don't see a continued alliance building there between the Russian Federation and China.
Thanks to Nina Jankovic of the Wilson Center. And her book is still available, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News and the Future of Conflict. Nina Jankovic in DC. Let's bring in Mitchell on the other side of the US, and Rachel's listening in Hong Kong this morning. Mitchell, to you first of all, your first impressions then of the way the two leaders conducted themselves in the briefings, perhaps, and what maybe our listeners should take away as, if anything of value came out of this.
I'm not so sure that Americans are paying deep, encyclopedic attention to this summit and perhaps all of the diplomacy that President Biden has engaged in Europe. But it is a tremendous contrast to the previous president. I mean, what we are not hearing is either sort of outrageous statements or bombast or, the flip side of I can sit privately with this man and make a deal with him. There was so much intrigue and lack of, breaking of precedent in diplomacy every time the former President Trump, engaged with leaders and especially with Putin that lack of attention to this in the U.S. may not be a bad thing. It may just signal that we're kind of back to, kind of normal international relations. They go up, they go down, etc.
Yeah. Do you think Americans would have expected to hear a bit more about an or else? I mean, I talked about Colonial Pipeline, and that was a major, massive hassle all up the East Coast. And it was squarely pinned on Russian hackers, right?
Yes, and and there's little doubt at this point in the minds of most Americans that the Russians are behind election meddling and misinformation and a lot of hacking. But a pipeline not working for whatever it was, week, 10 days, and long gas lines. Long gas lines happen when there are hurricanes. Long gas lines happen for a whole variety of reasons. And I don't think anybody yet really understands how you stop these attacks. And so, and what's more, we don't know what our own cyber offensive capabilities are, and Biden and the Defense Department don't want to tell us either.
Yeah, fair.
Because they want it to remain, a potent threat, which means we don't tell you what we'll do. I suspect that if at some point we bring down, I don't know, the Russian movie industry or something, as a sort of insult and a way of saying, look, we can hack you and wreck your week too.
Yeah.
Americans will probably be pretty happy if it's pinned on us and the American government says, I don't know, it wasn't us.
Rachel, I want to pick up, if you would, on that point about the invisible third part of this triangle. If you buy that narrative, it was interesting, Nina saying, yeah, I think that's right, in as much as Biden's kind of trying to split the Russians off from Xi Jinping. Is that a strategy worth pursuing?
Yeah, possibly. Although I think, certainly from looking at it from this part of the world, what seems much more striking is just how big, how powerful China is. And obviously attention has to be paid by the rest of the world to Russia. But I think, as one of your speakers was pointing out, China is really the big game in town. China and Russia are friendly. You can understand why the Americans would want to split them off. Recently we've been celebrating the centenary of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. And if you look back to those years, the 20s and 30s, the entanglement of China and Russia, the brilliance of Mao's strategic thinking and the way he ran that relationship probably has its reverberations and resonances right down until the present day.
I think the thing is, we're all old, all three of us are old enough to remember when these summits were genuinely crucial because the potential for thermonuclear war was at stake, right? And it was frightening. It was genuinely frightening during the 70s. And I can remember that quite vividly as a child growing up in West Germany. I don't think that feels very frightening today, Rachel.
Yeah, but perhaps we should be a bit more worried about it. China is constantly telling us how peaceful it is, but we look at the possible flashpoint, I think the big flashpoint potentially of Taiwan, and I think it's always a mistake to go, history repeats itself. But you look at the way that the First World War was built up, And you have here the China wolf warrior diplomacy. You have the US, often it seems not looking at Chinese as real people at all, but as sort of automatons manipulated by this wicked Xi. And you think about Graham Allison and his famous Thucydides trap. He said that the threat of nuclear war will make that Thucydides trap, the conflict between the dominant power and the coming power, i.e. China and America, less dangerous than it might be. But let's hope so. Who knows, though?
Absolutely fascinating. We never thought we'd hear about the Thucydides trap on these matters. You're with the BBC World Service. Over recent months, as the American vaccination programme picked up speed, state and federal officials began looking for innovative ways to persuade those who are still reluctant to get their jabs. In some states, lotteries took place. Get your shot this week and you could be in the running for $1 million. Or, even cleverer, everyone in the state is entered in the lottery, vaccine or no vaccine, but if you win and you haven't had the jab, well, some of the incentives are even closer to home, by which I mean closer to the stomach. Since March, Krispy Kreme have been handing out a free donut every day to anyone that can prove they've been vaccinated. Cue media kerfuffle.
Since March 22nd, when that debuted, when that free incentive for COVID-19 vaccinated Americans, 1.5 million donuts were given away by the donut giant. And now, if you may remember, it was first faced with controversy that perhaps his free donut incentive was trading off one pandemic for another pandemic, being the obesity crisis. But CEO Mike Tattersfield rebutted those critiques in an interview with Yahoo Finance back on March 26th.
Listen, we're a sweet treat company, and if folks don't want to visit a donut shop, they don't have to. Folks that want to get a vaccine, if they decide to, come by in Krispy Kreme, pick up a donut, they can. That's how we look at it.
That was Brooke De Palma of Yahoo Finance with that wee scoop. In fact, the health food nuts at Krispy Kreme didn't even make a commercial advertising their largesse because they know they can rely on the media to do the job for them, which we've just done all over again. Now, it's not just happening in America. Rachel, I've been looking through an extraordinary list of the goodies on offer just in Hong Kong, and I think probably top of the list is a flat, an apartment worth, well, what's 11 million Hong Kong dollars worth, roughly?
About £1 million, 1.2 million US dollars, something like that. In Hong Kong's very overheated and unaffordable property market, that's still a moderate flat, actually. It's about 500 square feet, a bit less the flat that's on offer, in an area that's up and coming, but we're not talking about the peak. But nonetheless, it's a very attractive offer. Hong Kong has suffered from the most enormous vaccine hesitancy. It's kind of frustrating. It's got a super well-run vaccination program, and currently maybe 16 to 18% of people are fully vaccinated. And so one did think that if anything is going to break this, it will be a flat and a lottery, a combination that really appeals to Hong Kong. And it has produced a good effect, but it's not very clear whether it's just a spike and people are falling back to their fear of the traumatic side effects of the vaccine. That's what's really putting off people here.
Are these initiatives working in America, Mitchell?
Well, allegedly, yes. I mean, a number of states, my state, Oregon, I think is offering a cash prize. I think it is through the lottery for someone to win who is vaccinated. I've heard of free college tuition and, smaller bonuses and things. It seems as if it would make sense from a purely kind of rational economics standpoint. There are people, some portion of the people who are not yet vaccinated aren't committed, 100% diehard to not being vaccinated. They may be hesitant because they're a little bit, jab shy, and or they don't know a bunch of people yet who've been vaccinated, but they're probably theoretically open to it, and so that nudge can really make a difference. And there's a hardcore that is not going to be persuaded by any of this.
Here's a thought. Isn't this rather grotesque that one country, one city, can put up the kind of prize money for one person that would enable an entire nation somewhere else in the world to get everyone jabbed up?
Well,
yeah, I must say in Hong Kong, it's business, it's private business, and one particular business, Sinoland, that really led the charge on that. And there wasn't that sort of negative reaction. I mean, some people in the business sector, I have to say, sneered a little bit and said, look at Sinoland, just grabbing all that publicity for their property development. But most people really welcomed it. The internal government leadership of Hong Kong is quite failing, really. I believe the last time they measured it, which wasn't that recently, Carrie Lam, our chief executive, had something like an 18% approval rating, so 82% disapproval. The government really doesn't cut much ice. The medics really want people vaccinated and sort of think whatever it takes.
So corporate Hong Kong is coming to the rescue, perhaps. Thanks so much. Lots to get into in the second half of the programme. Left on a little bombshell there. We're going to talk about US interest rates, talk a bit about the risk of rising inflation, could talk about unemployment. Mitchell's going to help us out with some of his work for Marketplace. We've got news next here on the BBC.
Now let's look ahead to what's coming up on the BBC World Service. At 1:30 GMT, we're on assignment.
I'm Lina Sinjab with past stories of the civil war from my home country, Syria. This week, a photographer determined to capture the beauties as well as the horrors of Raqqa, the former stronghold of so-called Islamic State.
Then at 2 GMT, you can hear Outlook.
Cal and Claire met, fell in love, and decided to buy a place to live. But their happily ever after took a strange turn when Cal accidentally bought a derelict manor house hours from the nearest major city. Join us to find out what happened.
That's followed by Witness History.
With me, Claire Bowes. Today, I'm taking you back to 1982 and a moment in TV history that helped change the way victims of rape were treated in Britain.
That's all still to come here on the BBC World Service.
Hello, welcome back. This is the BBC's Business Matters, today with Fergus Nichol in the company of Rachel Cartland in Hong Kong and Mitchell Hartman in Portland. The US Federal Reserve concluded its latest meeting on interest rates on Wednesday by deciding to, leave them just as they are. But what about inflation that's been rising as the national economy emerges from the corona crisis? Well, according to the Fed, that rise is, quote, largely reflecting transitory factors, end quote. So I asked Susan Schmidt of Aviva Investors in Chicago what on earth that means.
The Fed is trying to capture the impact on prices that is happening right now because we had frozen supply chains. There are constraints and bottlenecks that appear when you try to bring them back online. And those issues are causing increased prices to be felt by the consumer. The Fed believes that once those bottlenecks go away, pricing will return to a normal level and price increases will dissipate.
Are you convinced that the Fed is nimble enough, Susan, to respond to what may be quite protracted problems with global trade? Or they seem somewhat dogmatic. This is our policy on inflation. This is our policy on interest rates. We're sticking to plan A. Right, so a stronger possibility than we thought a couple of days ago of an initial rate hike at some stage in 2023 or before 23?
The Fed is signaling 2023. Market participants will guess around that. And of course, the market always tries to front run the Fed. So the differences will be shown in the interest rate curve going forward. At the moment, I think the Fed has come out confidently saying that they're bringing forward their expectations for how quickly they will reduce policy support and how quickly they will come to the point where they need to make an interest rate increase. Chairman Powell, in his words, said they are thinking about raising interest rates. And that really does describe where they are right now. They're ready to address the topic at some point.
In the meantime, out in Main Street America, How is inflation hitting the average household, the average business? Is it a worry yet? Rising 5% doesn't seem like a big problem in the short term, but it could get worse.
It could get worse, and in the longer term, clearly that is a pressure on the consumer. The personal consumption expenditure data, the PCE, has shown that prices have increased more than we've expected. However, again, this goes back to the debate of transitory or the new normal. Right now, the Fed is maintaining that it is likely transitory, and they are willing to wait it out. The Fed is in a predicament because overall, their goal is to look at the health of the economy and employment levels. Total employment in the United States is still millions of jobs below pre-pandemic levels.
Thanks to Susan Schmidt, as always, speaking from Chicago. Something went a bit weird in the middle of that interview. Sorry about that. Quick word on that before we pick up a point on unemployment. Mitchell, are you seeing material effects of inflation on the West Coast, or is it still not a problem yet?
People are aware that prices are going up, and they're going up for a lot of different things, rent and home prices and some food prices, restaurant prices. But people are also aware that everything is changing fast, and you don't necessarily notice restaurant prices if you haven't been to a restaurant in a year and suddenly it's open and you can go in, So I think that the transitoriness is, to some extent, I think, as the Fed is guessing, is about supply chains just getting back up and running again. But it may also just be that people aren't used to doing all these things yet. Doing them again a lot, and that for a while at least, people's decisions, assuming that they have jobs and they have money, are not necessarily going to be governed just by, is it $1 more than it was last year or something.
Okay, we'll come back to jobs and money with you in just a second. Rachel, pick up on this, on the supply chain question, because we were hearing last week that the problems out of Yantian and so on were a direct cause of inflation as far away as America, and Hong Kong is not immune because all these shipping things come right back to the port right where you are.
Yeah, they're not currently having an effect. I think our merchants and retail industry and so on is actually very clever at managing the supply chain. After the initial effects of the pandemic, supplies in Hong Kong have been good. We're actually suffering quite little from inflation. The government, of course, is still sitting on a great heap of money, and they have been trying to hand it out in relief efforts, waivers of public housing, rental, and so on. And there's shortly going to be a handout for every citizen of 5,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is a bit over 600 US. Recently, the civil service had been deprived of pay rise because the survey shows that actually there have been pay cuts throughout the private sector. So inflation currently doesn't look like an enormous problem for us.
Interesting. Let's see if that cash handout helps boost the approval ratings of the government a little bit, as you were mentioning earlier.
So bigger cash handouts than that have had no effect. I think their problems are much more deep-seated. A bit of bread and circuses won't do it.
All right. Thanks for that. Let's go back to the point that Susan made about employment, or perhaps more importantly, unemployment. And I want to pick this up with Mitchell, because I know you've been working on this for our friends at Marketplace. A quick overview, perhaps, first on what's going on with jobs in the Northwest, and maybe any family experience you can share in that regard.
Yes. Well, I cover employment and unemployment, and then summer comes along, and my 21-year-old daughter gets home and needs to find a job, and got one right away, serving and washing dishes in a local bakery. And it is supposed to be a good summer for youth, for summer jobs. There are a lot of restaurants and bars and movie theaters and things that are just starting to open, and they can't necessarily find the people who worked there a year and a half ago. Those people have maybe moved on, maybe decided that they figured out that they can make it, maybe on one income for a family, and there isn't good childcare at the moment anyway, and schools aren't fully open. So a lot of the people who were working aren't necessarily available, or don't want to work yet, or don't need to work yet. And on the other hand, people who can be ready to work on a dime, like my college-age daughter who's home for the summer found a job right away, and at a pretty good wage too. Minimum
Excellent.
wage here is about $14 an hour. So.
Okay, well, congrats to her. And what we're going to do now, let's get our engineers in London to roll the piece that you've prepared for Marketplace.
With a freshly minted master's degree in public policy, 26-year-old McKenna Brock has been job hunting for more than a year.
Some days, I sit down and go through 20, 30 applications. And I'm happy to go wherever there's work, but the problem is that there isn't much work, or that I'm not finding it.
She's landed some interviews, but no offers. She keeps hearing that someone with more experience got the job.
When you get constant rejection over and over and over again, it does start to feel a little bit deflating. You start to doubt yourself. Something I'm doing isn't working right.
She knows a lot of people are going through the same thing.
Like my mom, she's got years of marketing and she can't find a job.
That's Tiffany Brock, who got laid off from her job managing national beverage sales for a company in Tucson, Arizona, back in June 2020.
I've got a great resume, I have great experience, and I started applying. Unfortunately, so did everybody else.
Some jobs had thousands of applicants. She found some of the process humiliating.
They didn't even start interviews until after you wrote essays and why you wanted to work for the company. They wanted videos demonstrating your best career moments.
The first challenge folks like the Brocks face, says UMass Amherst sociologist Ofer Sharon, the stigma of long-term unemployment. Employers are less likely to hire them. And, says Sharon,
there's a tendency for job seekers to internalize the stigma, have fears that, maybe something is wrong with me.
Leading in turn, says Carnegie Mellon psychologist Denise Rousseau, to
a loss of confidence, a high level of anxiety with looking for employment, interviewing, re-entering the workforce. And that tends to be a self-perpetuating cycle.
First order of business in helping the long-term unemployed, says Sharon, is to connect them with support and solidarity groups and counseling.
Recognizing not only does it take a long time to get a job, people may be feeling shame, addressing that head on, and then start to talk about strategy and networking and resumes.
Denise Rousseau says as employers staff up again, they would do themselves a favor to tap current employees to recommend their unemployed friends for jobs.
People who have friends in an organization where they're being hired are more likely to be successful and to be retained in that organization.
Public policy has a role to play, too. Ofer Sharon argues that government should bar employers from discriminating against the long-term unemployed. Peter Capelli, director of the Center for Human Resources at the Wharton School, says government-directed retraining programs have a poor track record. Instead, he suggests going hyper-local, linking schools with employers.
You could say, for example, let's figure out what these, small group of employers in this town really needs and what they really think they're going to be doing in the next year or two.
For her part, Tiffany Brock is more worried about her daughter's long-term unemployment and career prospects than her own. She says she doesn't feel much stigma being out of work this long because the pandemic took her job.
It feels like you have permission to be unemployed. Obviously, being let go wasn't based on my performance or ability to help the bottom line. It truly was a condition of nature, right?
Ideally, employers will feel the same way.
Mitchell, thank you so much, and thanks to our friends at Marketplace for letting us run your piece. And I'm going to get Rachel to pick up off the back of that, because I'm wondering, firstly, in the context of the bigger picture, unemployment related to the business environment that you were describing moments ago. And I was wondering specifically whether enough people are leaving Hong Kong now, perhaps enabled by citizenship schemes elsewhere, to create a number of vacancies, or is that not a kind of countable phenomenon?
It isn't yet, I don't think, and perhaps it never will be quite, because the government here is obviously so cagey about coming out and coming clean on emigration. But I think it's a super interesting question. We know from the British government that there have been, within just 2 or 3 months, 34,000 applications for permission to take up the BNO visa, the British National Overseas Visa, to go and settle in the UK, which wasn't possible before. As I say, the Hong Kong government is hardly putting out big statements or big bits of research on how many people are taking it up. But I think all of us who know Hong Kong well have the strong impression that many, many people are going. It's, I think, concentrated particularly on families with school-age children. They're saying, I don't want my children to grow up here. And obviously both they and their children are very important potentially to Hong Kong's economy. Again, Carrie Lam, our chief executive, has a solution to that. We also have the standard demographic problem of an aging population, and her solution is that the elderly will go and live across the border in China, and that mainlanders will come in and make up for any employment gaps. And we can't underestimate how well-educated, how technically advanced, how adaptable many young mainland Chinese are. So perhaps we will indeed see that kind of great shift. Native Hong Kongers going to UK, going to Canada, which has also made some very generous offers of settlement, to particularly to young people who've studied in Canada. And mainlanders coming in, and that complete change in personality that we're seeing will solidify.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thanks again, of course, to Mitchell. Business Matters on the BBC. If you were listening to the show about this time yesterday, you'd have heard an extended interview in which my colleague Ed Butler spoke with Gretchen Carlson, an American broadcaster who successfully sued her then boss at Fox News, Roger Ailes, for sexual harassment. That interview, by the way, is still available on our website. Just Google BBC Business Matters. You'll find all our recent episodes. Anyway, today we are developing the theme with a look at whether smart tech can help increase a victim's confidence in reporting, and the role that the HR department plays, if any, in tackling these workplaces offences. In fact, Gretchen Carlson makes another appearance as Ed's second extended report begins.
You watch your career disappear in front of your eyes as you become lesser and lesser and lesser. And they take away plum assignments from you, and they suddenly give you a bad performance review, and you're suddenly ostracized from, the in-group. It's a way of trying to make your life so much like hell that you'll leave, right? Why do we do this to people? Why do we think that's okay when they simply have had the courage to come forward?
Gretchen Carlson is fighting for legislative and cultural change in companies to see problems addressed. But just how widespread are they in the modern workplace? Obviously, that will depend where you live. But even in firms describing themselves as liberal-minded in rich world countries, surveys suggest that at least 75% of workers are unwilling formally to report a sexual harasser, especially if they're a senior manager. Nuala Walsh has conducted research on the subject. She's the founding director of the Global Association of Applied Behavioural Scientists.
When I was doing my research, overwhelmingly, people regret when they speak up, because when you get past the dopamine rush of doing the right thing, the moment of heroism and you feel good about yourself for doing something, that's when the trouble starts. And I did quote a survey that put it into very real numbers. 82% of people were retaliated against, 60% lost their jobs, 17% lost their homes, and 10% nearly lost their life in attempted suicide. Now, yes, it was a few years ago. Have things changed? I hope they've changed. That weight of retaliation is inevitable. Companies ultimately will put the company first. And when they hear about these complaints, it depends who the complaint is levelled against and what the potential impact might be from a reputation or a risk perspective. So if it's in the middle ranks, they leave it to HR to deal with the problem. But if it climbs and if it approaches the C-suite, there is a real problem there in terms of getting people to do the right thing.
So a bully or a sexual predator better watch out if they're in the middle ranks, but if they're higher up, there's a good chance they'll get away with it.
Correct. I think a fundamental error that most employees make is that HR's role is less to serve the employee, but more to protect the company on people-related matters. The problem is that is often done at the expense of the individual. HR make a calculated bet there. How likely is the individual, the victim, to make a case? And how likely is it that this can be brushed under the carpet? And they make that evaluation in every single scenario when a grievance is raised, regardless of whether it's about sexual harassment or anything else. And they base it on their experience, which is, well, we've had it before, people eventually get paid off and they go away.
Nuala Walsh. I put that to Rachel Suff. She is the Senior Policy Advisor for Employment Relations at the UK's Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development.
Well, I wouldn't accept that view. It's the role of HR very clearly to protect individuals from sexual harassment. It's the responsibility of the whole organisation to do that. But HR have got a really special kind of responsibility in terms of making sure that doesn't happen, because actually it's not an opposing interest in terms of the employer letting it happen to employees. The two sets of interests go hand in hand.
I totally agree with you, Rachel. I'm just saying that we both know there are plenty of examples where that hasn't happened. Very high-profile cases where, particularly when the harasser is a senior member of staff, it looks as though the company is more interested in, firstly, protecting their reputation and secondly, obviously, protecting senior management than they are perhaps a more junior member of staff who has a complaint.
I don't know what specific circumstances you're referring to there. All I can say is that the very strong guidance and messages that we put out there, HR is being very proactive, developing cultures, they're inclusive, fair procedures in place to deal effectively with any complaints.
Wouldn't it be better to have an independent ombudsman available to people in these situations? Because ultimately, you and HR can say what ought to happen in companies, but the company itself is going to pull rank on you. The senior management are the ones who call the shots. If it's an independent ombudsman, they can read the letter of the law.
If you're just using a third-party ombudsman, that's not really sorting out the bigger issue within the organisation. Employers have to take responsibility. They've got a duty of care, so they've got to stand up to that legal responsibility. If they didn't do enough and take reasonable steps to prevent it from happening, then legally they could be responsible. So it's really important that they take on that responsibility, and that's what they should do. Just by deferring responsibility to a third party means that you're not solving the issue and helping to prevent it more widely in the future from happening in your organisation.
Speaking on behalf of the human resources industry, Rachel Suff, well, one thing that has changed with the rise of the Me Too movement is at least a greater awareness among women, especially, that they aren't alone, that at least there is a chance the predatory behaviour they're experiencing has happened to others around them. Netta Madoff is an entrepreneur who used to work in UK government, where she says she suffered harassment herself. She left rather than report. She decided to create an app, a device that firms sign up to, allowing their workers to report anonymously, if necessary, what they're seeing and experiencing in the workplace. She feels this offers a huge step forward for both bosses and workers to tackle the problems they're experiencing before they become a serious crisis.
The app enables people to create safe records of events that happen to them on their phones that are time-stamped by our tech, including the opportunity to upload any digital evidence that they may have. And then when the time is right for them to come forward, they have 3 ways of doing it. The first one is to come forward anonymously. The second one is to come forward in name. And the third one is the ability to submit under the condition you're not the first or only one to be reporting this. And there is an opportunity to have continuous communication through a trusted channel, even if the reporter is anonymous. And that is in itself a huge benefit because it helps the company to ask additional questions and any additional information in order to drive for quicker and more efficient resolution of cases as quickly as possible.
So I've got an app on my phone as an employee. Is that something that will automatically be paired up with my company management, with HR?
You do need to be part of an organization that is subscribed to Vault. But what is important to note is that it is a very safe, separate place for you to take records and be very much in control of your own information.
And the app also offers the capacity for someone to report only if there are others making a similar report. In other words, it provides that kind of safety in numbers experience.
Correct. So if there's been past complaints or at least one in the waiting, there will be a match. Reporters don't see who else is involved or how many people are there, but reporters do have the power of saying, I will only submit this if I'm part of a group, if I'm part of a pattern.
But hers isn't the only one out there. The employment lawyer, Ariel Weindling, launched a similar product called Not Me in both Europe and the US, where employees don't need the consent of management to use it in their place of work.
In the US, the app is free for any individual to use. Anybody can go on Not Me today on the App Store or the Google Play Store to download the app and report, even if their company is not a subscriber. When employees reach out to us and report, our team of trained experts will assist as best as we can.
How does this help workers? I mean, as opposed to simply, sending an unsigned note to your own HR team saying, this guy is behaving badly around the workplace, you need to look at him.
When you send an anonymous note, no one can follow through with you. No one can ask you questions. No one can promise you that you will be safe, that you will not be retaliated against, that we want to hear from you and that we want to help you. We expect them to report in real time. When something happens to you, please do speak up, do let us know. And we want companies to be put on notice. It will create a risk for the company if they do not look into issue.
Does the app provide the means to aggregate or collect evidence against somebody?
Yes, it does. Whether it's a video, emails, text messages, with a report when you submit a report through the Not Me platform.
Is that not a charter for somebody to be snooping, to be spying?
It's not what it's about. I mean, we cannot control the way people do things. The vast majority of people are normal people, they're smart people, and they will use tools in the correct manner it's supposed to be used.
But as a lawyer, would you accept that there are risks around allowing anonymous reporting against people?
I'll put it this way. I think there is a risk today for companies in not changing their approach to workplace misconduct. There is a risk for a brand in not listening up to their employees with sincerity. I think there are many risks when you do business, but I think this is certainly not a risk. This is a smart decision.
That's Ariel Weindling, CEO at #NotMe, ending Ed Butler's report. Produced, by the way, by Nisha, who also is producing this programme right now. Very busy bee. Last words then from our guests in the programme today. Mitchell, listening in Oregon, the role of HR contested, tech seeming to help.
Yeah, it does seem like there's that possibility of being able to report these things without having to walk into the HR office that you're pretty sure is actually defending your boss. And that seems to make sense. I'm so sad, though, about people who go through all of this trouble and retaliation, et cetera, and in the end think to themselves, boy, I shouldn't have done that, because it's just a no-win situation.
Yeah, and end up leaving sometimes as well, with leaving that behind them. Rachel, your perspective on this?
Oh, well, I'm very cynical, I'm afraid, about the tech app and so on. I think there's a real distinction to be drawn between rape, physical assault, sexual assault, something that can be reported to the police as a crime, and the demeaning jokes, banter, remarks, unwanted sexual approaches and so on, which can be part and parcel of a very unfair and toxic culture. And I think the only way to actually attack that is culturally. I'm on the board of the Women's Foundation, and one of our most success here in Hong Kong, and one of our most successful programs is called Male Allies, where we recruit men who are very willing to be involved. They want to be involved because, as somebody said, most men are decent people.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry we had to cut you off. We are flat out of time. We're back tomorrow. Thanks both.